Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seats, we're going to get started. Hello again. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. And hopefully over the lunchtime you got a chance to go and peek at the crowds. It's pretty incredible what's happening outside. If you're wondering, I hear the Raptors are very far behind, still on Lakeshore, so it's going to be a while before they are here. So hey, you never know. Maybe we'll see them. So at this point in the agenda, I just wanted to take an opportunity to thank our summit organizing team. Organizing an event of this scale requires a committed and hardworking team, so I'd like to take a moment to recognize the team. Trevor Esdale, Daniela Drazik, Serena Zhao, Dale Fitzgerald, Jason Gerbevec, Chantel Valerio, Jennifer Young, and June Tu, and our event planner, Proof. Thank you, team. On behalf of everyone here, we appreciate the work that you've done to organize this event. I also want to thank the Sheridan Center staff for the terrific lunch and for their hospitality and support throughout the day. So please, let's give everyone a round of applause. So now for our next speaker, Matt Golden, the CEO of Recurve, formerly OpenEE. Whether testifying before Congress or auditing Ellen DeGeneres' house, I'd want to hear more about that. Spreading the word about energy efficiency for years. An entrepreneur, policy advocate, and energy efficiency agitator, Matt is committed to bringing energy efficiency in the built environment to scale as a demand-side resource. Today, Matt will discuss how energy efficiency can function as a flexible resource to reduce capacity costs, avoid transmission and distribution investments, and deliver carbon savings by leveraging markets and competitive procurements to drive innovation and private investment. Please join me in welcoming Matt Golden to the stage.
All right. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for bearing with us over lunch, and hope everybody got some time on the street. The next panel asked me to be a little bit provocative, which is never very hard for me, so I'm going to hopefully give everybody a little fodder to talk about. So let's jump right into it. This is what we have to contend with here in Ontario and a lot of places around the country, and in Canada and the US and really Europe and around the country, as we decarbonize the grid, as we onboard renewables. We're getting all sorts of crazy new animals. You guys share our duck, but there are aardvarks and alligators and all sorts of things emerging. So as we talk about energy efficiency, and really I'm going to talk about efficiency, but really all things behind the meter that affect the way we consume energy and has an effect on load shape. It's becoming increasingly important not just to save energy, but to balance the grid and become a true grid resource that can allow us to decarbonize, help us replace grid infrastructure. Really everything we've been talking about today, but the big question has been how do we bring energy efficiency and flexibility into this mix as a true resource on par with everything else. The California duck curve, which I'm sure everybody has in policy circles anyways, heard a lot about. I think what's important is we're actually 4 years ahead of our projections right now. So this is the real shape that we're getting. It's getting worse on every dimension. So like a lot of highly taught systems, as we start to bring more and more renewables online, it's actually becoming much more volatile. And the need is growing much more rapidly than we had expected. This is resulting in a bunch of issues that I think everyone's aware of, but are really relatively profound. This is actually last year when we set the record for the most, I think it's actually 2017. But on this day, we set the record for the most renewables in the California grid at any point, which we have subsequently beat. But you can see the extreme load shape issues, this belly that we've created. But most importantly, the entire West Coast is selling. So we're generating all these renewables. There's all sorts of solar electrons floating around, and we got no place to put them. So I know there's a lot of hydro folks in town. We're actually, in that case, paying Oregon to shut down their hydro systems and take our solar, which is great for Oregon. We do a bunch of work in Oregon. They think it's really funny. But it's not really achieving our goals from a climate change standpoint. We're not saving carbon at that point, and we're actually costing ratepayers money. There's also a lot of grid infrastructure that's aging and needs to be replaced. This is an example of the Dynegy power plant in the middle of downtown Oakland, California. It's a 165 megawatt peak power plant. It's aging, needs to be replaced. We can't build more transmission and distribution in the California system anymore. We can't insure it. We keep burning down the forests. So it's kind of off the table. So our choices here are $600 million in new power lines we can't permit and can't insure, therefore we can't finance, or it's repowering this plant in the middle of downtown Oakland. It's a gas turbine. We have AB 32. We can't do that either. So we got to do this without wires. And what's interesting is, the foray was 80-20, 80% storage, 20% energy efficiency. But the energy efficiency, of course, has to be attached to the right feeders, and it has to happen during the right periods of time to when this power plant will be running. So it's not even all of Oakland. More interestingly, we bumped into a new problem, which is siting grid-scale storage works great. There's 2 feeders that come out of that power plant. One goes to the industrial district where there's plenty of room. The other goes to downtown. Turns out there's not that many places where you can site grid-scale batteries in the middle of Oakland, California. So we're actually seeing that the allocation that's going to demand flexibility, energy efficiency, DR, electrification, behind the meter changes is actually increasing because there's just not enough physical locations for the storage that we need otherwise. We're also a huge initiative in California that I think we're seeing in many other states and provinces around to electrify the grid, move off natural gas, which is really twofold. One is obviously reducing natural gas consumption has a great carbon benefit. There's also a lot of electric utilities that really like the idea of building new load from a business model standpoint in an era where we actually see declining load growth, which is a kind of existential problem in many cases. But it's not that simple. We electrify these new loads, we put in heat pumps. I think I'm a big advocate of heat pumps, but what we're really doing is building new electrical load in some of the dirtiest periods of time during the course of the year, winter evenings. So it's not as simple as just electrification. In fact, I think the mantra you're going to see in this presentation is there is no silver bullet, that we need to be technology agnostic, because the solution to electrification has to be heat pumps and heat pump water heaters and, of course, transportation and other things. But those investments need to be accompanied by a huge investment in energy efficiency. So if you're building load in the evening in the winter, that's the most valuable insulation you've ever put in a building. And you're also going to need more wintertime renewables and storage and other things to be more flexible in production and move and shift that load around as well to really reduce climate impacts. And this is really the name of the game, at least here in California, where I come from. But what is the marginal intensity of a kilowatt hour? Our goal now is decarbonization. So across the states, we've seen this huge transition in the last 12 months that I would never have predicted, actually. Starting with California, but cascading across utilities and states around the country, New York, Excel, Oregon, Portland, on and on. The goal is now shifting from renewables and RPS, renewable portfolio standards, to decarbonization as the goal that we have for our grid. But carbon is not an average. It's not a monthly number. It's very contingent on the marginal impact by hour, and it actually varies dramatically across the grid. So in the simplest form, the macro policy in California is use it when it's green, use less of it when it's red. And again, that is based on where you're located and when you're consuming energy. And it, of course, changes over time as we forecast renewable growth and also NOAA and DERs and what we think they're going to do. And you can see even out in 2030, obviously there's a lot more clean energy on the grid, but there's still big patches where we're running on fossil fuel infrastructure and emitting carbon. So the big question, and I'm here to talk primarily about energy efficiency, but again, we think more in terms of flexibility, slightly broader look where we think it's DR, it's efficiency, it's electrification, it's even behind the meter storage and other things that impact load. But in particular, how do we bring something like energy efficiency, something that can only be calculated, not measured, right? You have to actually generate a counterfactual, but how do you bring that into the grid and into these DER markets on par with other resources? And so we contend that the core fundamental difference between energy efficiency as we've been doing it and storage and other resources, whether it's a power plant or a battery bank, is that in all of these resources, we know when and where they're happening, right? They're not monthly averages. We have telemetry. We know when the savings are occurring. We know when the new electrons are being generated and where they're located on the grid. So the big question here for the IESO and for Ontario in general is how do we bring energy efficiency? And I think there's broad agreement that efficiency is one of the least cost, if not the lowest cost, most plentiful resources. But how do we actually start to scale it? How do we bring it into the energy mix and the DER mix as a resource equal to everything else? So the first thing is we need to weights and measures. right? You cannot trade, you can't have a market unless you have a product. And again, that's a challenge for energy efficiency because we're measuring against a building that's changed. So we need to actually calculate what would have happened if it wasn't for the retrofit. And so this is a bunch of work that my company spearheaded, but it's now all part of the Linux Foundation, totally open source. I encourage everybody to get involved in this process. Efficiency is a calculated value. So we started by developing methods. How do you go from raw data, clean that data, assign weather stations, normalize it for weather, normalize it for occupancy patterns, generate the savings, the uncertainties, and roll that up into a portfolio in a consistent, replicable way across hundreds of little engineering choices that are being made. So that's the Caltrack methods. They're empirically derived, they've been tested, there's a process that's ongoing. We don't claim to be, these methods aren't perfect, but they are very defensible and always open to better ideas, as long as they can be proven with data. And then the OpenE meter, which is a Python-based open source tool that runs those methods. All of this is in the Linux Foundation, available to all parties, no restrictions. Again, we are primary developers on much of it, but this is really to be thought of as a weights and measures. We need a product if we're going to create a market. And so what you can get with these type of open standards is you can, first of all, test their accuracy. We've done, for example, in California, we've tested these methods on every meter in the state to generate uncertainties. And there's no black box. It's replicable and reproducible by all parties. So with this, we're able to work with both utilities and the companies responding to utility price signals to track all of their meters, target their customers, and more importantly, track the savings that are occurring in aggregations of energy efficiency, DR, and electrification projects. So this is an example of what we call a resource curve. The top example, Advanced Home Upgrade, is a residential home performance program. The middle one is a commercial deemed lighting program. And the bottom one is nodal avoided cost on an hourly basis in California. And you can see that this breakdown is showing over a 24-hour period and then broken down by season when the savings are occurring. And then you can connect that directly to what the avoided cost is and measure it in the same way as any other grid resource that's in the market. This is an example of those same programs against the marginal carbon intensity by hour. And so what you find is that all efficiency and all behind-the-meter flexibility is not created equal, and there's no such thing as average general reductions. Everything we do creates a load shape impact. And when you add this up, we realize that we've thought of commercial lighting as super low-hanging fruit, but based on when those savings are actually being delivered into the market, that we're actually generating 59% more carbon reductions in California with residential efficiency as with commercial lighting, just based on the time coincidence of when that's happening relative to that red and green chart I showed earlier, when the power is clean and when it's dirty. So with this, we can work with both the utilities to identify, look, we have a grid constraint in a certain location, it's happening in a certain time period, it's coming from a certain sector, let's go target them. And instead of picking winners and deciding what are the technologies and business models that we're going to deploy, we can start to think of this like a market-based price signal, where we'll actually pay for the outcomes over time rather than upfront. So many folks in this room are probably from the supply side, and the idea of getting paid in advance based on an Excel model or some prediction is kind of surprising and different, but in energy efficiency, we tend to get paid in advance based on some average. So the idea of getting paid for performance is kind of a new idea in efficiency, though it's pretty much how all markets are constructed otherwise. So when we talk about creating these markets, and this is where the IESO, but also we think of the value stack, there's been a lot of talk about the different values in energy efficiency or any DER. There's capacity, there's energy, there's T&D, there's carbon values, there's ancillary services. They may in fact go to different folks in the stack. But a lot of what we do, and when we think about DERs and efficiency, we think about what we consider business model. Which is, what are the technologies, what is the consumer financing, how are we going to deploy it, right? And we think fundamentally, there's a lot of folks in this room are right, there's a lot of folks that are wrong. This is a business model choice. There's going to be thousands of answers to this question. And that we should avoid, from a policy standpoint, picking technologies pretty much at all costs, because it's very, very hard to be right. There was a comment earlier about, the efficiencies of a DSO, for example, controlling a market, right? Which is that they can optimize for the most grid benefit. But I would challenge everybody that I think that's actually the existential problem, because I'm the one buying these services, and I care about my benefit, not the grid benefit. And so the winning solutions need to be this balance of what is going to work with customers, what's going to drive demand, what do people actually desire, that can be also optimized to maximize the grid benefit at the same time. So when we talk about sending a pay-for-performance price signal, what we're talking about is valuing the aggregated impact to demand as a virtual power plant, and that's the public policy, and saying, look, we'll pay you for the impact that you have really against the avoided cost of the alternatives on the grid. You go out and retrofit the buildings, install your smart thermostats, do a behavior campaign, whatever it is you're going to do that the customer actually wants. Sell them on comfort, sell the end customer on whatever works to drive demand. And you can aggregate this tertiary cash flow that comes in the form of essentially a power purchase agreement in reverse. It will pay you to reduce energy at 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. because it's cheaper than installing new power lines or a battery. And the you in that equation is not the end customer, but it's the company that's out, or the business that's out actually developing the technology and the business model to address the need. And let's leave the business model of how the customer finances their solution, what's actually sold to them, how the channel is managed. We'll leave that up to the business to compete and develop the types of products, the Teslas and the Nests and the type of innovative consumer products that we need are going to come from market competition, not from reports, not from regulators, not from consultants. It's going to be brutal and it's going to be competitive, and that's where the good ideas are going to emerge from. So we end up in a situation where and this is actually, we're going to talk a little bit about PG&E's Pay for Performance program, which is residentially focused. And so the top chart actually shows resource curves for residential programs. And this is, again, residential HVAC, when the savings are happening by season, by hour of the day. Of course, the bottom one's that same duck curve. So these are the magic hours. It's that 4 to 8 p.m. system peak window. And in California, 6 p.m. is actually the real hour because that's when we're forecasting peak. So for PG&E, across the course of a year, it's somewhere between 7 and 12 times more valuable to reduce demand in that 4-hour window than the rest of the day. Right? We've been treating everything as like a blunt force average, but if we can target that period of time, we're saving, you'd say a ton of carbon, a lot of carbon, and having a lot of grid benefits that represent a huge avoided cost value. So in this model, PG&E is now sending a pay-for-performance price signal into the market. And they're saying, look, we're going to let you, and I'll explain who you is, but you companies competing figure out how to get your customers to say yes and what you're going to sell them and what your business model is. We're going to agree to pay you for the performance over time. We're going to pay 3 times as much, which is, by the way, a bargain for them, because I just told you how much it's really worth. We're going to pay you 3 times as much if you can deliver savings in that peak period window. And this is resulting in new business models. These are the first 4 companies in their pay-for-performance program. Some national implementers, some local implementers, a company that does behavior analytics. Each are really free to go compete with each other, find their customers, develop business models, change their business models as they learn. And they're getting paid over time, and they're being paid monthly based on an agreement. And this is where the Caltrack open e-meter stuff comes in. We're going to pay you based on the savings that are delivered. We can all see it. We can all track it. In fact, we're updating for most of these aggregators their savings on a nightly basis. And that enables not only competition and innovation in the market. We no longer have to pick the technology or dictate how they're going to implement the solutions. Their interests are aligned, right? They need to get their customers to yes, and the more savings they deliver, the more money they make, or vice versa if it doesn't work. And that creates a cash flow. And this is really important because at least in the US, we spend about $8 billion a year on ratepayer energy efficiency programs, which sounds like an awful lot of money, but it's not. The scale of the problem is drastically larger. $8 billion a year doesn't get you hardly anywhere in a place as big as the US. So this allows us to drastically increase the scale of the market. And these pay-for-performance contracts sound really scary to folks that are used to getting paid in advance in the efficiency industry. But the good news is you pay for it. Those cash flows can be financed the same way as you build any other grid infrastructure. And we're already doing this now in a number of states, in New York and in California. So you're going to get paid over time. It turns out energy efficiency in a portfolio is a very stable resource. It's highly predictable. You can insure it, and you can finance it not with consumer credit, which is primarily what we're doing. We think we're going to build the next grid based on people's credit cards, which is the most expensive possible capital. Instead, we're aggregating that power plant. We're paying for it with project finance, with infrastructure investment, the exact same way that we would a solar farm or a storage deal. And these deals are happening right now. And in fact, we have a surplus of financing. We need bigger deals. That's our problem. It's not a lack of financing, it's a lack of scale, if anything's problematic. So this is what efficiency looks like in a bucket, in an aggregation. It's highly stable, right? Now, it turns out all those reds had their bills go up, and we have other people on the other side saving 40%, but the portfolio itself is very, very replicable and very stable, and it looks like an insurance product. So while we don't necessarily know if you are going to save 20% on average, if you get enough folks that have similar attributes in a bucket, you'll get extremely stable returns, and it's highly replicable. So it's the kind of the difference between an engineering project and an insurance product, fundamentally. And efficiency, again, if you're a procurement person and your job is to make sure the savings are actually there when you need them, you can be confident in that. But also, if you're in the market and you're making a bet on your business or financing or insuring these portfolios, you can be very confident in that cash flow will actually deliver. And we are actually helping provide, again, when I say we, my company is in the middle. We don't take performance risk because that would be a conflict of interest, but we provide underwriting analytics to folks like Munich Re that are insuring these portfolios today. And so if you're an implementer of these solutions, you're not going to get let off scot-free, but you finance that cash flow, and you're still getting paid predominantly in advance, but the interests are aligned through the market. And most importantly, again, the type of financing that we're able to use now for these flexible resources behind the meter is project finance. It's infrastructure investing. So rather than building this huge investment in this virtual power plant that is behind the meter DERs, and then expecting to pay for it with credit cards, we're instead paying for it with pension fund money, private equity, the type of investors that actually want long-term returns at a much lower interest rate. So the important thing is now we can finance a bundle of retrofits the same way as we would a power plant. So again, it comes back to measurement. So all that's great. The challenge, of course, is that the literal definition of a market is two or more parties agreeing on a price for a product. And when we talk about flexibility, we have historically lacked that product. It's been a bespoke industry of different methods, and the standing joke, which is unfortunately true, is you could ask 10 engineers for the savings on the same 100 buildings and get 14 answers. They might vary by 30%, and they're all equally right. So that's where we need an agreement, and we need to collaborate on the measurement techniques so that it is ubiquitous and available to everybody, it's defensible, and maybe most important, it's consistent and replicable. So this is just some quick examples. This is actually very similar to the type of interface that PG&E has available across all of their programs in California now, but also most of the utilities in California are on this platform. IOU, Muni, and CCA, also Oregon, New York, and a bunch of other states and some international as well. Most importantly, what it gives you is the ability to get real-time or near real-time telemetry into the performance of your program or your business. So rather than waiting till the end of 4 years to see how you did, you can literally, in many cases, we're pulling this data and updating it every single night. And you can see it includes savings, but also what are the attributes? What are the types of projects I'm looking at? And it gives you the ability to do analytics and filter. And that's really where it gets super interesting. So if you're a utility or a DTO and you have a grid constraint, you can, at the highest order, figure out where's this coming from, what sectors should I target, and even what exact buildings have the highest potential. So one of the things that's potentially the most beneficial that is often left on the table is just the ability to target high potential customers. So it turns out, and this is actually the big secret, everybody, which is if you want to save energy, you have to use it first. And so we find that in many, it's a joke, but it's not really a joke. We find that if you apply that basic thinking to a lot of our efficiency programs, it turns out we're really good at figuring out in advance who those negatives are likely to be and who the high savers are. And so if I'm doing an HVAC building shell program and I want to save between 4 and 8 p.m., it turns out we're looking for the buildings where when the temperature goes up or down, there's a lot of change in energy use in that period of time at a high volume with a good model fit. And that's an excellent predictor of high savers, and the reverse is true for the negatives as well. And in many cases, we can double the returns on our programs in terms of savings by identifying the people actually using the energy before we go retrofit the houses. And this can be applied up and down the value stack, using this data just to optimize what we're delivering and having the flexibility, because we don't have to regulate the business model because we're paying on performance, to allow companies to innovate and iterate. We also have the ability to measure, again, the hourly impact. And this is the big kind of, when you look at CalTrack and the open e-meter, there's going to be a lot of familiar there. The goal was never actually to invent newfangled methods. It was to create consistent, replicable methods. When you get into AMI data, which is where it really shines, we're based on something called a time-of-week temperature model, which is a very well-established approach that we liberally borrowed from the national labs. Our kind of mantra is find the best stuff and then iron it out, not invent newfangled things unless you need to. But the ability to, again, measure the hourly impact, and of course then we know where that is on the grid at the same time, is really the huge shift in all these behind-the-meter resources. And especially for energy efficiency, there really is no such thing as monthly average savings. Everything affects load shape. And when you do that, we have the ability now to track for a utility like PG&E, but also SMUD and others that we're working with across the country. We can track all of their programs. We can allow them to drill down right to the individual building, track back out, and actually see the impact of their whole demand side effort, and then be able to tie that to their avoided cost calculations. So we can treat efficiency just like every other resource on the grid. And the basic policy that we're moving towards is to say, look, there's a meter, and there's a grid side, and there's the building side. Maybe we don't care if this change in demand is coming from storage, or it's coming from IoT, or it's coming from insulation. Maybe what we care about is what happened. What was the change in demand? And the basic policy, in our opinion, should be as simple as we should do all cost-effective, meaning lower the cost than the marginal cost of the alternative. We should do all of the cost-effective flexibility behind the meter before we go in front of the meter. Because when we go behind the meter, we're producing co-benefits for our customers, and we're attracting private capital to the mix as well. And we should exhaust all of that opportunity first. And it's really important. It's not energy efficiency versus storage or versus EVs or anything else. When we run the numbers in California at a 50% rate of solar, there's a flexibility gap that emerges of almost 50%. Solar and renewables are accelerating so quickly. And this is not a rub, this is nothing negative about storage, but it's starting from a much smaller baseline and it's not growing as quickly. And so this gap is actually increasing. And so it's really an all hands on deck type of a strategy. We need all of the in front of and behind the meter resources we can possibly get to actually decarbonize and remain stable. So the last thing, and then I'll pitch it to some questions, and the next panel is going to cover a lot of these same topics, I'm sure in more depth. We do think the future is treat the behind the meter flexibility and energy efficiency being a component of that, exactly like other resources. Bid it into the same markets, pay for it as it happens, let the market innovate on the solutions. But I would just put out there that in advance of that, as the IESO and others create those markets and they start to spool up, if you are running efficiency programs, if you're a utility, if you're a company out there deploying solutions, there's a place to start right now that does not require asking permission or changing anything, which is start tracking everything you do. Get the data. Use that, there's the big hairy, let's go change the world and we're going to do efficiency through procurement, which I think is going to happen before we know it. But you could take any efficiency rebate program and track your performance and do some really simple things like target the right customers, send your leads to the contractors delivering good results, do quality assurance where it's not working as well. Just start to use that intelligence to improve what we're doing. And what we're building is an actuarial data set at the same time, so that as these markets emerge and the IESO says we want to buy efficiency as it happens, if you can deliver it when and where we need it, you're ready for that. And you'll get near-term returns on those investments. It's kind of a no-brainer. The benefits far outweigh any of the costs. So again, we think flexibility and energy efficiency, the big idea here is make it work like everything else. And we think with standard measurement at the bottom of the stack, we can do that, and everything else is ready to go. And there's a tremendous amount of innovation in the market, and there's plenty of financing to pay for it. So thank you all very much. And I think I have a few minutes for questions.
David Katz, I'll ask you about the capital investors. Mm-hmm. So the green building effort said that there's lots of money for financing energy efficiency, but it has to be secured. It has to follow I think it's the capital investment program. that we're looking at with the CAGBC. Does that fit into this model?
Yeah, so the most important thing is to think of the different cash flows. So if a customer is making an investment in their building, whether it's for green building or energy efficiency, what they're getting is their own benefit out of it. A more comfortable building, better tenancy rates, whatever. But we're fundamentally underwriting the credit and asset worthiness of that investor, or of that building owner. So what's different here in project finance, and these coexist, by the way, these are two separate cash flows in the same project, is that we're not underwriting the individual anymore. We have a counterparty, hopefully, that's a utility or someone that we're pretty sure is going to pay us when we're underwriting the cash flow. And so you actually approach that underwriting differently. One is project finance and one is definitionally consumer finance.
And it's not double counting.
What's that?
It's not double counting.
No, these are different benefits.
Complementary, okay.
Yeah, I mean, you got to look, the main point is you look around and say, who's getting the benefit? If you retrofit a building, the customer's getting some of the benefit, but that utility is getting some of the benefit, and that carbon market and the public, these are all, and there's a little talk about that in the value stacking, the idea of anybody who's benefiting. Here's what it comes down to. We shouldn't ask individual customers to break out a credit card to pay for an investment in their building that is actually sending a bunch of benefit out to a utility. That's actually detracting from the value of the project. We want the beneficiaries of the work to pay for it.
Thank you.
Hey, Matt, Duncan from ICF here. Maybe just one point where we deliver one of those pay-for-performance contracts aimed at residential energy efficiency in California. I would say that right now, I'm in agreement with you. We need more precedent there for financing. I mean, we're a decent-sized publicly traded company with a good balance sheet, and it's tricky for us actually to recognize revenue on those things. Right now, these financial instruments are expensive, and that cost ultimately just gets passed on by us to the ratepayer at the end of the day. So I think we need more precedent and scale to shrink those financing costs. One question, I guess, then I'd also agree with you that, right now how I'd put it is how we're valuing energy efficiency is essentially overly simplified, right? We got this sort of macro market view. It should be X dollars a kilowatt hour in Ontario. And we know that the only thing we know about that is that the price is wrong. We're overpaying some places and we're underpaying in other places for what we really should be paying if we could consider the distribution level value. So I guess my question would be, what distribution level activity data, in your opinion, needs to be provided to the market in order to be able to come forward with energy efficiency sort of focused proposals, locational temporal value in mind, that's not there now? It seems to me that there's a whole lot of activity data that would need to be provided in order for a company like us to come forward with an analytical approach to actually show that, hey, this is to the benefit of the ratepayer locationally, temporally.
So again, I think it's all about the price signal. So, when you look at who's getting the value on the T&D, when that exists, who's getting the value of the capacity, which may be the utility. If there's an energy value that would go in California to CAISO, it's about lining up those parties and having a price signal to respond to. I think right now you're seeing kind of general signals like save between 4 and 8 p.m. as a starting point, but the idea is to get those much more targeted and ultimately have values based on time and location across the grid and potentially multiple locations, multiple values in any single location to respond to. I think it's okay to start with a slightly more general view and kind of drill down to that over time. And then I'll have to close on this, I think, and hand over to the next panel. But in terms of the cost of financing and insurance, I agree it's higher than it will be in very short order. It's a function, the way you underwrite these portfolios is based on performance data. And we've done a rather, as a broad industry, negligent job of getting that data together over the years. And so it's hard to move from uncertainty to risk. And so you're paying a premium for that early on, which is really consistent with other asset classes. The first time you go get a rating and try to securitize solar, for example, you're paying a much higher rate. But what we need to do is increase the scale. And we need to work, everybody here who's ever run a program, let's go backwards and get all of that data. And honestly, we'll get over this problem in a year or two with real performance data. But also on a note, I'll just say, even if it costs 20% to finance and insure the performance, if you are a utility and you spend $1 on efficiency, it's very common to only get 70 cents worth of savings when it's all said and done. In pay for performance, you always get 100%. And so even if you pay 20% to guarantee the savings and all you do is pay for the actual savings, you're coming out 10% ahead. And so one thing to always just remember is that the current system is so crazy inefficient and there's so much fat that even if you're paying 20% to insure and finance, which is actually higher than it costs currently, that's still a good deal. And it's just going to get better over time. So the best thing that we can do is send a clear price signal and get this market to scale as quickly as possible, because that will drive out both the performance costs of delivery and also the cost of capital and risk management. But with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next panel, and I appreciate everybody's time.